Right now, at this very moment, every major oil trading floor in the world is watching the same thing on their screens. A live map shows dozens of ships completely frozen in place. They are not sinking, not damaged, just stuck, lined up across open water with engines running and crews waiting for instructions that are not arriving. This is what a $200 per barrel oil crisis looks like in its earliest stage, before the wider world even realizes it has begun. This is what a global supply shock looks like hours before financial markets fully react. And if you are watching this now, you are seeing it before most people understand what has actually changed. This is Professor Jiang Insight, where major geopolitical moves are interpreted before headlines catch up. Stay with this closely, because what is unfolding cannot be ignored or delayed. In the past 48 hours, Iran has officially moved to close the Strait of Hormuz once again. This is not a symbolic warning or a negotiation tactic. It is a formal operational decision, supported by naval deployments, patrol activity, and a communication blackout issued to commercial shipping networks across the Gulf region. At the same time, the United States Navy has forced 23 vessels to turn back as part of an ongoing blockade of Iranian ports. That number has been reached in just a matter of days. Meanwhile, the ceasefire that was recently described by analysts as a fragile but real breakthrough is now being viewed by insiders as effectively collapsed. It has not been officially declared dead yet, but in practical terms, it is already failing. This moment is extremely significant. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping route. It is one of the most important strategic choke points in the entire global energy system. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow corridor every single day. That includes energy flows to major industrial economies such as Japan, South Korea, India, and China. At its tightest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, with shipping lanes just a couple of miles across in each direction. Iran controls one side of this critical passage. That geography alone is why global energy security planners have worried about this region for decades. Whoever controls the Strait of Hormuz holds influence over a key pressure point of the global economy. And now that pressure point is being actively tightened. But the most serious issue is not immediately visible in the headlines. There is a deeper operational detail inside what Iran is doing that changes this from a standard crisis into something far more dangerous. We will get to that shortly. First, it is important to understand the scale of what has changed. When most people hear about an oil choke point, they think of tankers, barrels, and fuel prices at the pump. Those effects are real, and they are coming. But what is often missed is how fast the system reacts. The global oil market does not adjust slowly to disruptions. It reacts instantly. Traders do not wait for confirmation over days or weeks. They immediately price in worst-case scenarios within hours. Futures markets move, options shift, and once financial contracts adjust, the real economy follows quickly, because airlines, refineries, and shipping companies are all tied to those prices. So when Iran declares the strait closed, the market does not wait for verification. It reacts as if the closure is already fully real. And this time, the physical situation suggests that assumption is correct. Military analysts are reporting that Iranian naval activity in the region is not just symbolic. Patrol vessels are active, coastal defense systems are on high readiness, and communication with commercial ships has shifted from cautionary guidance to direct restriction. This is a critical change in language and posture. An advisory warning tells ships to proceed carefully. A prohibitory warning tells them they are entering a contested military zone at their own risk. That distinction matters deeply. Insurance companies understand it immediately. Once insurers classify a route as a war risk zone, premiums rise sharply. At that point, most commercial operators simply stop sailing through the area altogether. In effect, the strait does not need to be physically blocked with mines or missiles to become unusable. It only needs to become too dangerous and too expensive to operate in. And that is exactly what is happening now. Now consider the 23 vessels turned back by the United States Navy. This is not a routine naval patrol. It is not a symbolic exercise. It is sustained enforcement activity with real consequences. A blockade does not only stop exports from a country, it also prevents imports from entering. Iran depends on imported goods such as food, medicine, and industrial components that support its domestic economy. When those supply lines are disrupted, pressure builds internally, not just on the government, but on the population as well. And historically, when internal pressure increases, governments face a difficult choice: negotiate or escalate. In many cases, states under severe pressure choose escalation first, because it signals strength domestically, while negotiation under blockade conditions can be seen as weakness. This is where the situation becomes even more unstable. Iran is not simply absorbing pressure passively. The system is already moving toward its next phase. Iran is not reacting passively in this situation. It is actively shaping it. What is unfolding right now appears to be one of the most calculated and coldly strategic moves seen in recent geopolitical memory. According to multiple reports, Iran has begun imposing transit fees on ships attempting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. But this is not a normal tariff or port charge. It is being described as a protection-style payment, effectively a cost demanded from commercial shipping companies in exchange for safe passage through a militarized and contested waterway. Think about what that means for a moment. At the very same time Iran is declaring restrictions on the strait, it is also demanding money for passage, while still sitting inside a ceasefire negotiation process. This is not a state moving toward peace. It is a state extracting value from instability, while diplomatic documents are still being discussed. Intelligence assessments suggest these payment demands were already being communicated through indirect intermediaries even before the official closure announcement, which strongly indicates this was not spontaneous. It was structured in advance. That detail changes everything. It means the closure was not simply a reaction to pressure from the U.S. blockade. Instead, it was part of a prepared system that became active the moment conditions allowed it. And once that system is in motion, the incentives shift dramatically. If Iran is earning revenue from disruption in the strait, then instability itself becomes profitable. In that scenario, maintaining tension is no longer just a political strategy. It becomes an economic one. This is where the situation becomes more complicated. The ceasefire is no longer just politically fragile. It is now economically inconvenient for Iran's hardline structure. Every day the strait remains in a controlled state of disruption. The fee system continues generating returns. That turns instability into something self-sustaining. What emerges is not a traditional geopolitical standoff anymore, but something closer to a system where access is being monetized under threat conditions. At the same time, the United States is operating with its own strategic logic. The naval blockade enforced by Washington is not arbitrary. It is a direct response to what U.S. officials view as violations of trust during the ceasefire period. From their perspective, Iran used the temporary reduction in tensions to reposition military assets, reorganize supply routes, and strengthen its operational readiness. In other words, the U.S. believes the pause in conflict was used strategically by Iran to prepare for escalation. The American response, therefore, is to increase pressure through maritime enforcement. The intention is clear: raise the cost of non-compliance to a level where continued resistance becomes unsustainable. However, military analysts warn that this approach carries a serious risk of miscalculation. Maximum pressure strategies tend to work only when the targeted state still prioritizes economic survival over strategic goals. But when a government decides that its political or strategic objectives outweigh economic suffering, pressure no longer produces compromise. It produces consolidation. In such cases, states often respond by tightening internal control, framing external pressure as aggression, and using hardship as justification for further resistance. This pattern has been observed in several long-standing sanction environments, where external pressure reinforces internal unity rather than breaking it. Iran has experienced this dynamic before, and its institutions have adapted to it over time. This leads to a difficult set of policy choices. One option would be for the United States to lift or soften the blockade in exchange for renewed diplomatic engagement. On the surface, this would stabilize markets and reduce immediate risk, but it would also signal that disrupting maritime flow creates negotiating leverage, potentially encouraging similar strategies in the future. It risks turning the strait itself into a recurring pressure tool in every future crisis. Another option is further escalation of the blockade, increasing enforcement intensity and expanding restricted zones. While this would increase pressure on Iran, it would also place significant strain on global energy importers, particularly in Asia. Countries like South Korea, Japan, and India depend heavily on Gulf oil flows, and prolonged disruption forces them to seek alternative arrangements. Some of those alternatives could bypass U.S. policy entirely, weakening coordination among allies. A third possibility is a negotiated reopening of the strait tied to mutual concessions and a return to ceasefire commitments. However, this requires both sides to prioritize compromise over leverage. At present, neither side appears politically positioned to make meaningful concessions without appearing weak domestically, which makes this scenario difficult to achieve in the current time frame. There is also the possibility of third-party mediation, most likely involving major Asian powers with significant energy dependence on the region. Such an arrangement could stabilize transit flows through informal guarantees or financial agreements. However, while this might reduce immediate disruption, it would also shift the balance of influence in the region, potentially reducing the central role of the United States in Gulf security architecture. Finally, there is the most dangerous option: military escalation. Any direct confrontation between U.S. and Iranian forces in the Strait carries a high risk of rapid escalation due to proximity, short reaction times, and the density of naval traffic. Even a minor incident, an intercepted vessel, a warning shot, or a misinterpreted maneuver, could trigger a chain reaction that neither side intended. What makes the current situation particularly unstable is that all of this is unfolding under extreme time pressure. The 48-hour ceasefire window is not just a diplomatic deadline. It is also a countdown for energy markets, shipping insurance systems, and national security planners across multiple continents. Governments in Asia are already adjusting contingency plans in anticipation of prolonged disruption, even before full confirmation of how the situation will evolve. If the ceasefire collapses without a replacement framework and the Strait remains in its current state of controlled closure, decisions will shift from strategic planning to reactive crisis management. And history shows that when decisions are made under pressure in such conditions, outcomes become far more unpredictable and far more dangerous. To understand the scale of what is happening, it helps to step back. The Strait of Hormuz has been a strategic pressure point for decades. During earlier conflicts in the region, it was already the site of repeated confrontations over tanker traffic and oil flow security. In response to past disruptions, major powers, particularly the United States, developed doctrines designed to ensure the continuous movement of energy shipments through the Gulf. Since then, every regional actor has operated with an understanding of that precedent. Iran has consistently tested the boundaries of how far pressure can be applied before triggering direct intervention. In response, it has developed increasingly sophisticated methods of indirect disruption, strategies that rely less on direct attacks and more on economic and logistical pressure that raises costs without crossing clear military thresholds. The current fee-based system fits into that pattern. Instead of physically blocking ships, it leverages insurance risk, uncertainty, and operational fear to create the same effect: reduced traffic and higher costs. In many ways, it is a form of economic warfare that operates below the threshold of conventional conflict. What makes this moment different is how coordinated the elements appear to be. The closure announcement, the enforcement actions, the fee system, and the timing relative to diplomatic negotiations all suggest a structured sequence rather than isolated decisions. Each move reinforces the others, producing a layered pressure environment that affects military planners, markets, and governments simultaneously. And because this sequence appears pre-planned, it also implies that future steps may already be prepared. The current phase may only be one stage in a broader strategic cycle that activates depending on how the next 48 hours unfold. The key uncertainty now is not just what Iran will do next, but whether the actions already prepared will be triggered automatically by how the situation develops. In such environments, escalation often becomes less about deliberate decision-making and more about preset responses to specific conditions. That is what makes this crisis particularly difficult to stabilize. It is not simply a negotiation between two actors. It is a system under pressure, where geography, economics, and military positioning are all interacting at once. And in such systems, the margin for error becomes extremely small. If you want, I can continue with the next part in the same style or adjust tone, more dramatic, more neutral, or more analytical. A prolonged shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz does not impact the United States alone. It creates far greater immediate pressure on America's Asian allies. That uneven distribution of pain is exactly what generates political friction inside those alliances, and it is a vulnerability that competing powers can take advantage of. In reality, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a maritime corridor for oil. It functions as a stress test for how stable and resilient the entire American alliance system in Asia really is. And right now, that system is under visible strain. Intelligence assessments suggest that over the past 3 days, there has been an intense surge in private diplomatic communication between Asian governments and both Washington and Tehran. While the exact content of these exchanges remains undisclosed, the underlying dilemma is clear. Asian economies that depend heavily on Gulf oil urgently need the strait reopened. At the same time, many of them are politically tied to the United States and are expected to support Washington's enforcement actions against Iran. These two positions are increasingly difficult to balance because supporting the blockade means accepting ongoing energy disruption, and accepting that disruption means absorbing domestic economic pressure that governments may not be able to sustain for long. This is precisely the pressure point Iranian strategists appear to have identified. The United States may have the political will to maintain a blockade, but it becomes far more difficult to sustain if key Asian allies begin to openly oppose its consequences. And if the strait remains closed long enough, that opposition is likely to grow, not because these countries align with Iran, but because domestic economic stability will eventually outweigh geopolitical alignment. That is not ideological, it is structural politics, and it is exactly the kind of dynamic the fee-based transit system appears designed to exploit. When all of these elements are combined, the situation becomes clearer. A major global energy artery is effectively shut down. A naval blockade is applying pressure but also straining alliance unity. A parallel fee system is giving Iran a financial incentive to maintain instability rather than resolve it. A ceasefire still exists in name but no longer functions in practice. And on top of that, there is a 48-hour window that everyone is watching, but very few actors actually have a viable plan for. Meanwhile, Asian economies are accumulating energy security anxiety at a pace that will soon translate into political urgency. Military forces from multiple countries are operating in the same confined maritime space, where reaction times are short and economic consequences are enormous. And history shows that once crises begin in this region, they rarely resolve quickly or cleanly. What is unfolding is not just another geopolitical incident. It is a structural shift in how leverage works in the world's most important energy corridor. The next 48 to 72 hours will not just determine how this crisis ends, they will define the pattern for how the Strait of Hormuz is used for the next decade. If Iran succeeds in monetizing restricted passage and extracting concessions, then instability itself becomes a repeatable tool. If the United States manages to sustain the blockade through alliance coordination and forces a reversal, it reinforces American control, but at the cost of significant strain within its partner network. If external actors step in to broker a workaround, then the governance of global energy flows begins to shift away from traditional Western frameworks. And if the situation escalates militarily, it moves into a category of conflict that few current models fully account for. What experienced defense analysts emphasize is that the most dangerous phase of any crisis is not peak tension itself, but the moment when leaders begin to feel that the available options are shrinking. When decision makers believe time is running out, they tend to act rather than wait. And in maritime environments like the Strait of Hormuz, where ships are close, decisions are fast, and stakes are global, that urgency can quickly turn into irreversible escalation. The 48-hour countdown is therefore not just diplomatic, it is psychological. Before it ends, both sides can still frame their actions within a ceasefire context. After it expires, that framing disappears, and every move becomes part of an open confrontation. And once that shift happens, the logic of behavior changes. Caution becomes harder to sustain, and action becomes more likely than restraint. For decades, the global economy was built on the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open. Shipping routes, insurance systems, energy pricing models, and industrial supply chains all depended on that expectation. That assumption is now being tested in real time. And what this test is revealing is that it was never guaranteed. It was conditional, resting entirely on a balance of incentives that could be disrupted. The introduction of a fee-based system for passage changes that balance. If instability itself becomes a source of revenue, then the incentive structure shifts away from resolution and toward controlled disruption. That is a fundamental change in how leverage operates in this space. As a result, financial markets are already reacting. Energy futures are moving, risk premiums are rising, and insurance costs are adjusting upward. Governments are holding emergency consultations, and energy agencies are preparing contingency plans. All of this is happening while commercial vessels remain stranded near the strait, waiting for clarity that is not yet coming. For ordinary people, the consequences are not abstract. A sustained disruption in Gulf oil flows does not remain confined to the energy sector. It spreads quickly through transportation costs, food prices, manufacturing expenses, and household bills. As fuel becomes more expensive, every sector that depends on movement or production feels the impact. This is why energy shocks tend to ripple through entire economies rather than staying isolated. The reality is that the Strait of Hormuz is far closer to everyday life than most people realize. It influences the cost of commuting, the price of groceries, heating bills, industrial output, and even long-term investment returns. It is a foundational element of the global economic system, and right now that foundation is under pressure. Military analysts warn that clean resolutions within the current time frame are unlikely, unless there is significant diplomatic flexibility from both sides, something that does not appear politically easy for either. More often, situations like this evolve through partial escalations, delayed responses, and unintended consequences rather than neat agreements. The critical question now is whether any actor has an incentive strong enough to reopen the strait without extracting major concessions. If Iran is able to generate ongoing revenue from restricted passage, what motivates a voluntary reversal? And if the ceasefire framework collapses entirely, what structure replaces it? At present, there is no clear diplomatic exit that avoids validating the use of closure as leverage. There is also no politically easy concession available for Iran that does not appear as submission under pressure. This mismatch in incentives is what makes the situation structurally unstable. When incentives are misaligned at this level, resolution does not come from agreement alone. It usually comes from exhaustion, external intervention, or escalation reaching a point where continuing becomes more costly than stopping. None of these outcomes are clean. What is becoming increasingly clear is that the strait is not simply closed, it is being redefined. And in that process, the assumptions that once governed global energy security are being rewritten in real time. This is not just a short-term crisis. It is a stress test of how the international system handles pressure at its most critical energy choke point. Stay alert, because the next phase of this situation will likely unfold quickly. And when it does, understanding the structure behind it will matter more than reacting to the headlines.